In 2025, one of the most pressing social issues facing the United States, and indeed much of the world, is homelessness. The crisis is no longer confined to certain cities or marginalized groups. It has become a national emergency that touches every region, every age group, and every economic class. At the heart of this crisis lies one of the most powerful driving forces, the shortage of affordable housing. While addiction, mental illness, and unemployment are often cited as causes of homelessness, the most consistent and unavoidable truth is simple: when there are not enough homes that people can afford, homelessness rises. The housing market in 2025 reflects decades of neglect and failed policy decisions. For years, housing construction lagged behind population growth. Demand soared while supply stagnated. As cities grew and jobs concentrated in urban centers, the pressure on housing markets intensified. Rent climbed to unprecedented levels, homeownership became increasingly out of reach, and millions of families found themselves one paycheck away from eviction. In cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York, the cost of renting even a modest apartment has reached levels unimaginable to the working poor. Meanwhile, smaller cities and suburbs, once seen as affordable havens, are catching up quickly, leaving fewer and fewer places for low-income families to turn. Economists often describe the U.S. housing market as broken. For decades, local governments imposed restrictive zoning laws that limited the construction of multifamily housing. While these rules were often justified as a way to preserve neighborhood character, they had the unintended effect of choking supply. In many suburbs, large single-family homes on big lots became the only option, even as demand for smaller, cheaper units grew. The result, a severe mismatch between the housing Americans need and the housing that gets built. At the same time, the cost of construction skyrocketed. Materials, labor shortages, and lengthy approval processes made it increasingly expensive to build. Affordable housing projects that did move forward were often saddled with years of delays and price tags that reached hundreds of thousands of dollars per unit. Federal housing programs never fully filled the gap, leaving states and cities to shoulder the burden with limited success. The consequences of this shortage are visible everywhere. More families are doubling up, cramming into small apartments with relatives or friends. Evictions are at historic highs, displacing households with nowhere to go. Tent cities and car encampments are spreading not only in major metropolitan areas, but also in small towns and rural counties. Even middle-class families are feeling the strain, with rising mortgage rates pushing homeownership further out of reach. For young adults, the idea of buying a home has become a distant dream, while for seniors on fixed incomes, rising rents often mean choosing between housing, medicine, or food. The crisis also has ripple effects far beyond housing itself. Schools are seeing more children who face unstable living conditions. Employers struggle to retain workers in expensive cities because housing costs consume most of their wages. Hospitals often discharge patients who have no stable place to recover, creating pressure on the healthcare system. Public services, too, are stretched thin as housing instability overlaps with social challenges. In short, the housing shortage is not an isolated issue. It is one that affects entire communities. International comparisons highlight the depth of America's problem. In countries where social housing or government-supported apartments make up a significant share of the market, housing insecurity rates are much lower. But in the United States, public housing has been steadily reduced for decades, and programs like Section 8 vouchers reach only a fraction of those in need. Waiting lists for affordable housing stretch for years in many cities, and families are often told not to bother applying because the backlog is so overwhelming. The housing shortage is also reshaping the geography of poverty. Where once low-income families could move to more affordable areas on the edges of cities, those options are vanishing. Suburbs once seen as a refuge now mirror the high costs of city centers. In rural areas, meanwhile, the problem takes a different form. There may be housing available, but it is often outdated, in poor condition, or far from jobs and services. Either way, the result is the same: more Americans being pushed into housing insecurity. Policymakers often debate whether this challenge is primarily driven by personal choices or systemic issues. Increasingly, evidence points to the latter. Personal struggles such as health problems or job loss play a role, but these exist in every country. What makes stand out is the sheer lack of affordable housing. Researchers note that in cities where rents are lower relative to income, housing insecurity is rare, even when social challenges exist. Conversely, in places with extreme housing costs, the crisis spreads across all groups, including working families. Addressing the housing shortage will not be easy. Solutions such as updating zoning laws to allow more multifamily housing, increasing funding for affordable projects, and providing rental support are politically debated. Many communities resist new development, citing concerns about traffic or property values. Yet without bold action, the situation will only worsen. By 2030, experts predict that millions more Americans could face unstable housing unless supply catches up with demand. The truth is clear: a nation cannot solve housing insecurity without solving the housing shortage itself. Shelters, assistance programs, and community services may provide temporary relief, but they do not address the root cause. Until there are enough homes that people can realistically afford, the cycle will continue. Every year of delay means more families under strain, more children growing up without stability, and more pressure on public systems. Homelessness has always been a complex issue, but in 2025 the numbers are staggering. In the United States alone, over 650,000 people are estimated to be experiencing homelessness on any given night, a sharp increase from just a few years ago. This figure represents not only the chronically homeless, but also families with children, senior citizens, and workers who hold full-time jobs yet still cannot secure stable housing. Experts agree, the shortage of affordable housing has transformed homelessness from an individual problem into a structural crisis. To understand the impact of housing shortages, consider the basic logic. When housing supply is limited and demand is high, prices rise. Those with higher incomes can absorb the increases, but those on the margins cannot. In 2025, more than half of all renters in the United States are considered rent-burdened, meaning they spend more than 30% of their income on housing. A quarter of renters are severely rent-burdened, spending more than half. For these households, any unexpected expense, a medical bill, a car repair, a loss of hours at work, can trigger a downward spiral leading to eviction. Without sufficient housing options, eviction often leads directly to homelessness. The shortage is not limited to the United States. Across the world, major cities are grappling with housing crises of their own. In London, Paris, and Berlin, housing costs have skyrocketed, fueled by speculative investment and stagnant construction. In parts of Asia, booming urban populations have driven millions into slums and informal settlements. In Canada and Australia, homeownership has become nearly impossible for young families. The pattern is global: insufficient supply, skyrocketing costs, and a rising tide of homelessness. One of the most striking aspects of the 2025 crisis is how it affects working people. The stereotype of the homeless individual as unemployed or addicted is increasingly outdated. Today, many homeless people are employed, sometimes holding multiple jobs, yet unable to afford rent in their cities. Teachers, nurses, warehouse workers, and service industry employees are among those now living in cars, shelters, or on the streets. Housing shortage does not discriminate. It punishes anyone who earns too little to compete in overheated rental markets. The impact on families is especially devastating. In 2025, family homelessness has surged, with children representing one of the fastest growing segments of the homeless population. Entire families live in motel rooms, sleep in shelters, or camp in vehicles. The housing shortage means that even when shelters are full, there are few alternatives. Children who grow up in this instability face enormous challenges, from disruptions in education to increased risks of trauma and mental health struggles. For them, homelessness is not just a lack of shelter, it is the loss of childhood itself. Mental health and addiction issues are undeniably part of the homelessness crisis, but housing shortages make them worse. When people cannot access stable housing, they lose access to consistent medical care, employment, and social networks. Stress from living on the streets or in temporary shelters can exacerbate existing mental health problems. Addiction, too, often flourishes in environments of despair and instability. But these issues are symptoms layered on top of the fundamental problem. Without enough affordable housing, individuals and families remain trapped in cycles of homelessness. The public health consequences of homelessness in 2025 are staggering. People experiencing homelessness face higher rates of chronic illnesses, infectious diseases, and premature death. The shortage of housing forces many into overcrowded shelters where viruses spread easily, or into street encampments where sanitation is poor. Hospitals see frequent visits from homeless individuals with untreated conditions, straining healthcare systems and increasing costs for everyone. Once again, the housing shortage proves itself to be not only a humanitarian issue, but also an Cities have responded to the crisis in different ways, with mixed results. Some, like Houston, have made progress by focusing on permanent supportive housing, demonstrating that when affordable units are made available, homelessness decreases. Others, like Los Angeles and San Francisco, struggle despite spending billions because new housing construction lags behind demand and community opposition to shelters or affordable units remains fierce. In many neighborhoods, residents resist low-income housing developments, fearing property value declines or crime. These not-in-my-backyard attitudes deepen the shortage, ensuring that homelessness remains entrenched. The political response in 2025 reflects the urgency but also the division of the crisis. Some policymakers emphasize increased housing construction through subsidies, zoning reform, and public housing investment. Others push for criminalization of homelessness, attempting to clear encampments without addressing root causes. Yet evidence consistently shows that the only sustainable solution is increasing affordable housing supply. Without it, temporary shelters, policing, and outreach services are mere band-aids on a gaping wound. Another dimension of the crisis is the rise of invisible. Not everyone without a home lives in a tent or on the street. Millions of people in 2025 are doubled up with relatives, couch surfing, or living in motels. They do not show up in official counts, but they live with the constant threat of displacement. For many, this hidden homelessness is only a step away from ending up on the street, especially when housing shortages leave no path to stability. Technology and innovation have begun to offer some creative responses. Tiny homes, modular housing, and repurposed shipping containers are being deployed in some cities as quick, low-cost alternatives. Digital platforms help match unused rooms with those in need. However, while these solutions provide temporary relief, they cannot substitute for large-scale housing development. The scale of the shortage requires systemic change, zoning reform, public investment, and long-term affordability protections. As we look across the globe in 2025, one fact becomes undeniable. Housing is the foundation upon which all other aspects of life depend. Without stable housing, employment is unstable, health deteriorates, education falters, and communities fracture. Homelessness is not merely the absence of shelter, it is the unraveling of the social fabric. The housing shortage is not just an economic problem, it is a moral one. There are glimmers of hope. Cities that have embraced housing first, models prioritizing permanent housing as the first step rather than the last, have shown measurable reductions in homelessness. These programs recognize that treating addiction or mental illness is nearly impossible without stable housing. Evidence shows that when people are housed first, their chances of recovery, employment, and reintegration into society rise dramatically. The lesson is clear: solving homelessness begins with housing, but the challenges remain enormous. In 2025, construction costs are high, zoning laws remain restrictive, and political will is often lacking. The shortage persists because solutions require sustained investment, coordination across levels of government, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about inequality and privilege. For every luxury apartment tower built, thousands of working families still wait for affordable units that never arrive. The impact of the housing shortage is not only measured in numbers, but in life. Every tent on a sidewalk, every family in a car, every child sleeping in a shelter is a reminder that the system has failed. And yet, behind each statistic is a human being with dreams, talents, and potential. The crisis strips them of dignity, but it also strips society of the contributions they could make if given the stability of a home. In 2025, the homeless crisis stands as both a mirror and a warning. It reflects decades of choices that prioritize profit over people, luxury over necessity, and short-term fixes over long-term solutions. And it warns us that unless we confront the housing shortage head-on, the crisis will only deepen, spreading beyond city centers into suburbs and small towns. Homelessness is no longer someone else's problem, it is everyone's. The question is no longer whether the housing shortage contributes to homelessness. The evidence is overwhelming. The real question is whether society has the courage to respond. Will governments invest in housing as infrastructure? Will communities embrace affordable developments in their neighborhoods? Will we recognize that housing is not a privilege, but a human right? The answers will determine whether the homeless crisis of 2025 becomes a turning point or a permanent scar on the fabric of our civilization. As the sun sets over cities filled with both skyscrapers and shelters, one truth remains: until there are enough homes, homelessness will endure. The housing shortage is not just part of the crisis, it is the crisis, and solving it is the only way forward.